Hello and welcome. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and thank you for joining us for a timely conversation on the future of AI policy in Canada. Artificial intelligence, as no doubt everyone is now aware, is driving very rapid technological change, holding much promise and peril as the driver of the next industrial revolution that promises massive productivity gains and changes to the labor market, to some concerns as well about its potential for unwanted and unhealthy social change, disconnecting people from meaningful work and from one another in an increasingly online world, and an attention economy that tries to keep people glued to their screens. And today we're here to discuss Canada's approach to AI policy in light of this rapidly changing world order and as a middle power and economy. Just want to set the stage a little bit. We are home to a recent Nobel laureate, Geoffrey Hinton, whose pioneering research on deep and machine learning is behind generative AI technology now found in numerous applications. We have major AI companies in Toronto and Montreal, and yet I think it's fair to say the AI footprint in Canada is not that well known among the general public. And we've seen internationally recent remarks from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance at the AI summit in Paris, signaling the U.S.'s strong commitment to a pro-innovation approach to AI, and then on the other hand, the EU's more cautious approach. And so the stage is set, I think, for an interesting conversation on where Canada fits in this changing landscape. And with us today for this conversation are two leading young Canadian thinkers on AI and digital innovation. Ryan Karana is an AI practitioner in Toronto, a senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation, and a contributor to MLI, where he recently produced a paper for us on how to make AI's adoption productive for the bottom line and for workers. And we also have Lawrence Zhang, who is head of policy for the Centre for Canadian Innovation and Competitiveness at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF. And he leads research and policy analysis on how Canada can drive economic growth through innovation, technology adoption, and industrial strategy. And similarly, Lawrence recently produced a paper for us on AI adoption in Canada. So I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, great to be here.
Yeah, great you can be here. So just adding a bit more detail into those opening remarks for the context. I mentioned those comments by J.D. Vance, and he also criticized the EU's AI Act during those remarks for being overly bureaucratic, and just kind of warned that the heavy-handed approach to over-regulation at a time when AI is at the leading edge of innovativeness, and even as we see global competition among great powers increase along this dimension, now is not the time to be overly cautious. We've recently now seen the EU walk back and delay the implementation of its AI legislation in light of these and some other concerns from industry. And at the same time, kind of on the other side of the ledger, we see in the US, they had an AI moratorium that was going to be put forward, which would prohibit state-level regulation on AI just to avoid a very variegated and cumbersome regulatory landscape, actually get removed from the one big beautiful bill at the last minute, so signaling some concern on the caution side about AI regulation. So I think it's fair to say that things are in flux at the moment on this, but it's clear that the world's major powers see AI as a major economic and security and social issue, and are keen, I think, to tread carefully, but not too carefully, on the issue to harness its potential and avoid the pitfalls. So, first question to you both. What does this, kind of transatlantic tension between the two major approaches, I guess, in the Western world, you could say, to regulation of AI signal for Canada? Should we take our innovation cues more from the US or from the EU or a mix of both? Curious for your initial thoughts. Ryan, we start with
Ryan, you
you.
want to go start?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can go first. So I think when it comes to the US's AI moratorium, right? Like the likelihood of like the likely reason why a federal preemption was there was because we did see some state level legislation almost get passed. The most notable one being SB 1047 in California,
Mm-hmm.
which was a very interesting approach because for the most part it didn't really touch the use of AI. What it said and what the focus was is that extremely large models present possible risks, especially when it comes to security risks. Like if, the weights of a very powerful model, like, a frontier thing like OpenAI's O3 get leaked, like, hey, that's a concern because these are very capable systems. But the vast majority of AI models are usually pretty niche and specific. And so therefore their use cases are governed in other ways. It's a interesting technical approach that they had there, right? To focus on
Mm-hmm.
frontier. This contrasts extremely with the EU's approach. Like the EU definition of high impact systems, they had many tiers of classification. They understood that, it's not one thing called AI. There's different ways it fits into different kinds of applications. And, there's a difference between language models and vision models and all these kinds of things. But then when you try to create all these tiers, you're confused about what is the thing called AI that we're governing. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism of the EU Act comes in is why are you putting all of this into one thing? So there is a difference in kind of denoting the scope of what AI is. I understand a lot of what, JD Vance said, and the reasons for trying to put a moratorium in are more geopolitically motivated than anything else, right? Like if we do anything that could potentially hamper these frontier companies, which is what California almost
Mm-hmm.
did, well, what about a place like China with a lot of resources? So there's these different modes of understanding what you're aiming at. I actually think for Canada in particular, taking inspiration from that California bill is smart because it again leaves to, let's say, if you're worried about bias in healthcare, well, govern that under health regulation, not AI regulation.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
if you're concerned about the security implications of a model, now that's a specific thing that warrants AI regulation. But that's not what we've seen in the existing proposals. But that's kind of the different theories on how to regulate this.
Okay, fascinating. Lawrence, before we go to you, I want to follow up on one quick thing, Ryan, which is that you mentioned the frontier models. So there is a difference among the players in the field, so to speak, between proprietary and open, right? And many of these frontier models, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, are proprietary. And you noted the security concerns. They're the more high capacity ones that we don't necessarily want to get into the wrong hands. Can you just comment on that? Like for Canada, should we come down on one side or another with respect to proprietary versus open? How does that distinction fit into this mix?
Yeah, and even with our proposed ADA Act, they did put out some caveats for open models. And I think a lot of the philosophical reasons that people want to distinguish proprietary and open is open source models feel academic. And so we're stifling research and underlying innovation by regulating that field in particular, whereas
Mm,
proprietary models feel corporate. That, in many ways, to me, feels like an artificial distinction at this point. We do have the time it's taking between a proprietary model having a comparative open source model is shrinking. And a lot of what we've seen out of things like DeepSeek this year is that actually the cost to compete is also shrinking. So
mm.
there is kind of an artificiality in the distinction there. One feels more academic, one feels more corporate, but really on technical level and impact, they're not as distinct.
And from a security perspective?
Yeah, and so this is the risks of open source governance. And in general, right? Like so traditionally, right, if I'm putting out a model that's open source, I put up my code on GitHub, people can copy it and use it. I kind of get some trail. But if I just download it to my computer, which I can, and spread that around, well, it's very hard to trace what this piece of software that's super powerful, that just lives on some hard drive, is
Mm.
being used for. And so that does create some risks of its own, right? Like I don't want actors to have, and this was, for example, right, in the EU AI Act, they wanted to regulate as a prohibited use for political manipulation. Like in many ways, this is a near impossibility to detect when AI is used for a purpose like this. Um, but again, if it's open source model, if I can just download it and spread it to someone, well, I don't know if they're using it for that.
Okay, interesting. We'll get into that further. Sorry for that, Lawrence, but just wanted to make that clarification. Over to you.
No, I think not to break your framing a little bit, but I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. Like, sure, we can say we can chase the US, we can chase the EU, but they're operating from their historical, their material, their reasons for regulating, right? And so Canada can't regulate for balance. Like, we can't govern what we didn't build. We can't just say we're going to pick a side, but that's just drift. That's just sort of aimlessly wandering between two models that we have nothing to do with. So, the way I would like everyone to picture it is, including everyone sitting at home, is what do we want to achieve? Where do we want to be? What do we want AI in Canada to look like? And that's up for debate. I have my own personal framing, and I'm sure you do yours. I would say many people would agree. We want our AI companies to succeed globally. We want them to be able to do great stuff. We want to continue being amazing at research. We want to continue putting out this research output, but we also want to be able to capitalize and commercialize on it. We don't want to just publish papers and models and then have them commercialized in California by companies like OpenAI. And then thirdly, I would say, many people would say, I want AI used in a safe way, to increase our productivity across institutions, across everywhere, across the economy. As both Ryan and I wrote papers on for you, it's really sort of the least painful way of increasing Canadian productivity. And everyone's read a million Globe and Mail and National Post and Toronto Star op-eds. Canada has a productivity crisis. Here's what it means for you, right? There's like 50 of them a week. And if you boil it down, this is the least painful way in which we can sort of get around this productivity issue, is by straight up increasing our productivity. It's a productivity enhancing tool at the end of the day. So if we take these three goals in mind, how do we get there? Let's work backwards. Let's go outcome first. And what do we want? And that means, AIDA, does that help us adopt AI in healthcare, in education, in business? I would say no. Does it help advance Canadian research on the global stage? I would say no. And so, when we're regulating and when we're saying the EU is doing this, the US is doing that, we should be comparing it to our goals and saying, does this help us achieve what we want? I don't think Canada should sort of, if you have the US on one hand and the EU on the other, we shouldn't say we got to be smack dab in the middle, because that's balance. That's whack. Like that's insanity. What we need to do is basically, these guys are doing a good job with this. These guys are doing a good job with this. Let's take the best of both worlds and use those to accomplish our goals.
That's great. I don't think it's breaking the frame at all. It's a unique path. It's neither just in between or what have you. But I do think it's fair to say that Canada, being a Westminster parliamentary system with a lot of British roots, but being right beside the US, we do end up having, we have influences certainly politically from the political cultures of across the pond and down south. And so, but you mentioned a couple of interesting things, and we have a new AI minister now, Evan Solomon. He's just signaled his key priorities on the AI file. Very key to bring major new firms to Canada. The federal government, before the election, in fact, earmarked a couple $2 billion towards capital investments, including data centers and things like this. He's also suggested, our new minister, that part of the NATO commitments will be covered by AI investment. So I just want to ask you, in light of some of the recent developments on the file, how do you think the new government is measuring up? I should say as well, you mentioned the ADA Act, Lawrence. They have said for now that they're not going to reintroduce it. So that's, again, I think, signaling some caution, like the EU has said about their cautionary approach. They're maybe walking that back a bit.
No, I think they're on the right path. Do I agree with every single thing that they've recommended? No, but policy is sort of an interesting world where nobody's ever going to agree on everything. I think broadly speaking, if their goals align with everybody else's goals, and if their goal is, we want more research, we want more adoption, we want companies to use it, we want businesses to use it, we want hospitals and schools to use it, and we want Canadian firms that are doing really great work to be able to export and to be global leaders in a strategic niche. And I'm not saying, and I don't think it's realistic to say Canada's going to come out with a company that, like, a Canadian open AI that's going to beat everyone and dominate
Right.
China, and everyone in the world is going to be using our model, exclusively our model. No, I don't think that's the right approach. And I've written a lot about this in the past. And Canada's a middle-sized country, and we should have not middle-sized ambitions. We have large ambitions, but certainly find our niches. And so we're not going to be able to dominate in every single one. And so when the federal government's doing policy, they should have that in mind. It's how do we find our strategic niche? And I'm not saying I know what the strategic niche is.
Yeah.
And I would challenge anyone watching to tell me exactly what the strategic niche in which Canada will succeed will be. But I think, going where we're succeeding already and being able to double down and say, look, I know we're taking a bet, but if we don't bet, we're just going to fail. And I think that's the right approach. And to some degree, I think the federal government is doing that. To some degree, perhaps they're still being a little too cautious and a little too spreading the peanut butter. And I think the framing of it sometimes is a little, AI adoption. Just small businesses need to adopt AI, but realistically, where are we going to see more productivity gains across the economy? Like a hospital or a university adopting AI, or Kim's Convenience and the flower shop down the store, right? And so we can give flower shops $1 million in tax credit to adopt AI. What are they going to do with it? How is that? I'm sure on edge cases they will be better advertising copy, and might give them new ideas for flower arrangements, but it's not nearly the same level of productivity boost. And so I would really love for people to really think through what the theory of change is. If our aim is to boost productivity, what will boost productivity?
Yeah, just a couple of things to build off what Lawrence was saying there, right? So I fully agree, especially when it comes to the capital investment, right? Like we will never be able to compete with the US or China in capital investment. But I don't believe in the long run that's actually the key factor in this field, right? The key factor in this field is talent. And that's something that Canada actually has struggled with in the last 5 or 6 years, right? We trained some of the most luminary figures here, right? A third of the founders of the major California research labs got advanced degrees in Canada, right? Ilya Sutskever, who kicked off the field, was the founding chief scientist of OpenAI, does his PhD at U of T. Andrei Karpathy, one of the most brilliant computer scientists, University of Calgary, right? Like Canada has been this great training ground, but if you look at the stats of graduate retention, they're declining. More and more people see Canadian universities as a means to break into a US labor market. And so I love the tone. I love what the setting up a ministry with this direct prerogative signals for the country. More needs to be done on that labor piece. How do we retain the top talent here? And actually connecting it to the previous question, regulation helps here in some way. Because if it defines a vision of what Canada sees as what AI is and where it's going, that actually attracts talent. A lot of the most visionary people in this field are not just attracted to the big bucks, they're attracted to building something great. And sometimes regulation helps you define the terms of what it takes to build something great. And this is where, like, taking a lot of the cues from the California bill that was vetoed tells us, like, okay, here's a framing that appeals to some demographic of very technically competent people, and here's how we can, show that Canada has the commitment in that field. On the other point, and I fully agree with Lawrence, right? Like, if we're going to get a huge productivity boom, it can't be diffuse adoption among thousands of small businesses. In Canada, if you look at the history of technological transformation, we are a more get permission rather than ask for forgiveness culture, right?
Mhm.
And I've experienced this working in the AI field, where it's like I've done deals with US companies, and especially in the AI space, right, where there is unclear intellectual property rules. An American firm typically says, well, there's no rules about this, so let's just go ahead. Whereas I've dealt with Canadian
Or the
firms who are like,
rules are
well, there's
unclear.
yes, yeah, exactly, right. And so it's like if we finds out we were breaking the rules, okay, we'll do that when we get there, and maybe we'll have proof that the rules should be designed in a different way. Whereas in a lot of the Canadian businesses I've spoken to, it's like, oh, it's unclear what the rules are. We're going to wait for clarity. Our legal isn't going to approve this, right?
Mm,
And so that there is a cultural difference there. So what
right.
can get us over that? Well, it's government leadership in one way.
Mm,
We have a significant portion of our economy and a significant portion of our like labor pool employed in public service.
mhm.
And public service is something that, over the last decade, people have complained about a lot. Service quality declining and all of these various concrete things, right? I want my passport in X amount of time. I want a phone call answered by the CRA in X amount of time. These are natural use cases for AI. And the more our government shows a commitment to adopt them across these sectors, and a lot of the phrasing I've heard from our new minister and our new prime minister shows that they want to think that way and push that way. It'll deliver on things Canadians want. And if they build in such a way that it's templated, right? Hey, here's how we cut down CRA wait times by adopting AI. You push that out. Now, thousands of the Canadian small businesses who are waiting for something are like, okay, I have a clear path to follow. This is how they improve their customer service. I'm going to copy that approach.
Mm,
That's a great way to diffuse the innovation rather than waiting bottom up for everyone to figure it out and share it themselves.
yeah. Oh, very good. I'm just going to mention two things that both of you touched on that will lead into the next question. So, productive applications, absolutely. I note that the minister did signal that, yes, wants to look at deploying AI in various government ministries, for example. Lawrence, you also mentioned healthcare. So I'm curious what you both think about how they plan to roll this out and put a little bit more meat on that bone, that idea there. And then Ryan, you were saying with respect to where we spend our time and money, basically, like, yes, we can't outcompete China and another the US in terms of capital investment. And realistically, capital investment has been, I guess, perhaps up until now, with the recent DeepSeek kind of example, being seen to be crucial for success in this field, like building innovative firms here. So I see, though, that Canada, the current government has signaled through some of their recent investments that they think that is really important. So in light of Canada's status as a middle power, I think, Lawrence, you affirmed we need big ambitions, but we need to be realistic about our size and have a tailored approach in light of that. Do we need to be making these sorts of big capital investments to be successful, or should we be focused on something else? Like we've also, and it fits into this productivity question, should we be focusing more on being innovative in the application of AI rather than the capital investment side?
I think we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Like, we're not going to trip over our own shoes trying to do both. They're relatively separate in some cases.
Mm.
You're not going to ask Jeff Hinton to start working at a university AI adoption hub and say, like, how are we going to get this professor to use AI in his course? No, that's not his role. And I think we're largely talking about different people, different things, different programs.
Mm.
And so at the end of the, yes, but it is time and money, right? Everything is, there's only
Yeah,
one taxpayer,
there's opportunity
there's only
costs
one
too.
minute every minute, and so on and so forth. And so to a certain degree, that's true. But I think, if we want to continue being a world leading power on AI research and on AI creation and on firms and talent, I think we have to continue this. If we want to just be a taker and if we want to just do AI adoption the best, that's also a very valid path. I think, there's a lot to be said. Maybe we can be the absolute best in actually getting AI in healthcare. And I think, healthcare is obviously this sort of pain in the butt jurisdictional navigation in Canada. And there's a lot of complaints across the country about hallway medicine and long wait times and blah 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 blah. I think there's also an aspect of jurisdictional federal competition. Who can do better in this? And you see in some regards, occasionally in Canada, different provinces kind of compete and who can do a better job at implementing these things, especially, if it's hot, if it's trending, if it's cool, if they're not actually okay. And like one aside, when we're talking about AI capital for adoption, we're not talking like trillions of dollars. And I think people kind of get this confused. They associate like, oh, government should be adopting AI in universities, or farms should be adopting AI. Like, we're not talking billions of dollars here. Like, largely a membership to these models is often not very expensive, and it's a line item on your operating expense. It's not the same as building an additional hospital wing. So as an aside, I think just people have to get in the mindset of like, how can we adopt this? How can we be more productive? How can we be creative? And I think, to Ryan's point, government plays a big role in sort of de-risking. In Canada, nobody wants to be the first mover. That's realistically, you talk to these big corporations and their legal kills it. Managers say, I just don't see a use case. I'm sorry. I mean, like, if somebody shows me the way, I'm happy to do it, but I'm not going to risk my time, reputation, and money on doing something that's unproven. And so the moment you have a use case, people are going to start piling on, as it was with electricity, as it was with internet. This is groundbreaking, but it's also nothing new at the same time.
Yeah, just add on to that, right, Peter? I think I agree with Lawrence, right? It's not an either or thing, and the only reason why you would possibly frame it in an either or way is if we're talking about AI as one thing. So let's take a step back a little bit and say, well, what do we mean when we talk about AI? And there's an entire life cycle here, right? At the start, we're talking about the hardware components, right? The GPUs, the computer chips at the forefront that people spend a lot of money on. That's what we typically talk about when we're talking about big capital investments. The computer chips, the electricity needs, all the rest, right? So what can we do there? Well, there's already a signal from the new government a lot in terms of building up our electrical capacity and like energy. Unbelievably important input in this. There's needs to be more of a commitment on the chip side. We just had one of our chip leaders, Untether, get bought out by AMD. And one of the things in a lot of the commentaries on their sale was that it was difficult to raise the necessary amount of capital to continue building in Canada, right? So when we're talking about capital investment, getting people to build here, key part of that, there is a minimum required. It will still, no matter how much we invest, exceed the United States. But that doesn't mean don't do it. Do enough that something is here, right? But then we move further down the stack. Then there's the foundation models, right? And Canada has one major player here. We have Cohere. And, Cohere has top talent there. Their CEO was one of the co-authors of the original paper that launched this entire revolution, right? Co-inventor of the transformers. Cohere has a niche that they exceed on. They are really, really good at the document retrieval, question answering in enterprise context with their models. They do not have the same consumer mind share or application of an OpenAI. These are different scales and sizes of markets, but it's good to do one thing well. So now there's something in that, in the tech space. But the tech space is not all there is in AI, right? There is security software with facial recognition, computer vision, and the like. There's audio software for analysis there. There's video software, which is for analyzing what's happening in a video. There's entertainment applications of that. You mentioned the attention economy in your intro. It's huge space, right? So when we're talking about the models that impact the entire economy, there's tons of different types of these as well. It's not just a chat GPT, do we need to build our competitor there? Mm-hmm. But that's also not the end of the funnel. The further we go down the funnel, there's very sizable, profitable companies built on top of this model layer because they're tailoring it to an enterprise application, right? Mm-hmm. If you're deploying these AI solutions in hospitals, as Lawrence was giving as an example, I don't know if I want to let the hospital staff customize their own chat GPT to help them with documentation. There is some intermediary provider there that de-risks it and makes it applicable. That's also a space of competition. And the further down we go towards the end use case, the lower the capital needs are and the higher the human talent needs are.
Mhm.
And so at every level, there should be some degree of investment, but we need to know where our comparative advantage are and what are our focuses.
Yeah.
So that's not to say I'm going to give you an answer on which one we should focus on, but
Oh,
it is also
well,
to
so
say
that's
that just
gonna,
because something is just to say that just because there's some area where we should have a comparative advantage does not mean we stop caring about everything
uh,
else and go
sure.
entirely on that. That's too risky.
I think maybe it might help to sort of have an historical example. In the late 1800s, electricity was a thing. It became a thing, and we started building electrification and power plants, and they were highly capital inefficient, and they mostly just supplied power to rich people's homes. That was really the use case for electricity. So very rich aristocrats and capitalists could have light bulbs. But so over time, we built governments, built out power plants, and firms started doing electricity adoption, whether it's chainsaws, whether it was electricity in mines, whether it was rotary pumps and engines in factories. I don't know. I'm not a Victorian era economic specialist, but so the same thing is true. That we have to build the power plants, so we have to do the actual foundational stuff. But that is related, but also a separate thing to adoption. So you could build a ton of power plants, but if the chainsaw is never invented, you don't actually use the electricity on logging.
Oh, it's a great example. I still think, with some of these things, hindsight is 2020, of course, right? And it could be the case that we're making the right investments on the front end of the pipeline, the continuum that you just laid out, Ryan, or that those types of investments aren't as necessary, and it's more in the talent space, and we won't know until until some time. But
Yeah. And just one to build off what Lawrence just said, right? One of the key uh, tipping points in terms of electricity adoption was the idea of modularity. And so, like, electricity became the mainstay when people like Henry Ford came up with a moving assembly line. And the reason is because steam power, you have a central power source, so all of your heavy machinery is close to the power source, and then everything else happens in the rest of the factory.
Steam gets cold.
It took, yeah, and it took a long time for people to realize, wait, if power can be everywhere in the factory, we can redesign the step-by-step processes. And the same transformation had to happen for the computer, same for the internet. Realize the scale and the scope. This is a process design initiative. And I also think that Canada has somewhat of an academic leadership in this, right? Professors at Rotman at U of T, Ajay Agrawal, Joshua Gans, Avi Goldfarb, they've written what's basically the business textbook on this, called Prediction Machines. The Creative Destruction Lab that got founded here and is now a model at tons of universities around the world was all around getting frontier deep tech companies to think about this process design. So again, this is a place where the intellectual effort is heavy on that. And it's an inevitable key component in driving that transformation. Now, how do we transfer? This is the perennial Canadian problem. How do we transfer our research expertise to actual adoption in our large corporations? And I do think the government has a role to play in signaling
Yeah.
that because of the risk averse culture we've been talking about.
Well, that's a perfect segue to the regulatory landscape, making it not prohibitive, but innovation friendly. And I'll just throw out a recent comment for you to comment on from Jeffrey Hinton, one of our leading lights in the field, basically saying to the new minister that this stuff is very dangerous and needs to be regulated. What do you think he means by that?
Yeah, and this goes back to the conversation we were having on frontier models, right? When we speak of, and when most of these luminaries speak of the dangers of AI, they're really speaking of it in terms of existential risk levels, right? And what do I mean by that? When we have a system that's extremely powerful and connected to a lot of different tools it can use. For example, right, if you're using um, OpenAI's GPT or Anthropic's Claude, now you can hook it up to your enterprise systems. There's a thing called the bottom context protocol, which allows it to speak to any other tool, right? Hey, I'm using it to write code. You have access to my whole GitHub now. Oh, I'm using it to run my sales org. It can do things inside our Salesforce account, right? There's more and more systems the AI is tapping into. It has more power. Now, there's some security risks that are introduced by that, right? Now it sees everything. If I can hack into how your company is using it, I now have access to hijack things. But then we get to another level of security risk where it's like, this is very science fictiony in some sense, but
We
Anthropic
have to go
published a
there.
paper. Yeah, Anthropic published a paper where once their scientist was trying to shut down the model, it tried to use tools to prevent them from turning it off. Right. And now people get into the like Terminator territory of like, okay, well, what kind of tools does it have access to? What are the things the model is capable of doing to prevent itself to be shut off? Right. And so these are kind of really large scale threats. We're not really at that point, but given the speed and the pace, I get where some of that anxiety comes from. Hey, you
Mhm.
have something that touches all of our systems, even if it's not because the AI itself does something to prevent itself to be shut down, but like the who watches the watchman. It's using all of our tools, it has access to all of our corporate information, it's doing things with it. What if it does things wrong? What are the guardrails? What's the security? How do I prevent a foreign actor from hacking in and taking it over? This does require regulation. It requires strong security, especially when that descales and uses. That's a very different conversation than, Lawrence was mentioning Kim's convenience using ChatGPT to process some of its accounting faster. They're not the same conversation. We're talking about two very different things.
Lawrence, your thoughts?
No, I mean, I think I completely agree. You hit it
Yeah.
right on the nose. I think it's easy to talk about what you know, and they're working with frontier models that can be risky. But at the end of the day, it's a different world here that we're talking about. When we're doing AI adoption, when we're talking about, let's put it this way: you can have firecrackers and you can have bazookas. Both use gunpowder. Both are explosive. One is extremely dangerous. One is something you kind of let kids play with on Canada Day. And so, to say, oh, bazookas exist, ergo fireworks should not exist. At the edge case, you can say, yes, gunpowder can be quite dangerous. But in the similar thing, we can say there's nuance in this world. People can hold multiple frames at the same time, and people can have different opinions about different things, even if they're similar. And I think this is one of those cases where, we have to recognize, yes, there are risks, and these, very real, very dangerous sort of future time risks should be accounted for and should perhaps be regulated. But at the same time, does that mean we should try and kill off Kim's Convenience or Bell or Rogers or Loblaws from using AI? I certainly disagree.
Yeah. Well, it seems just from your comments thus far that, of course, we want to balance these competing things, but the particular way in which you seem to be threading the needle is highlighting these very high capacity frontier systems that you've noted, Ryan, and separating that a bit from the open AI applications, not the open AI, the firm, but the open source.
Open, comma, AI.
Yeah, applications. Let's move to the details of the proposed a potential regulatory landscape in Canada. Is that kind of right? Is that where you would lean, that broad division? What do you envision for the future of regulation in Canada?
Yeah, no, the current approach of distinguishing between proprietary and open source, that's not, I think that's a false approach there. I agree with some of the suggestions that are proposed about once your model has proved certain level of capability, right? Like again, when I'm talking about an AI model being able to affect changes in your organization, touching its critical stuff like Salesforce, right? Which has things like people's personal information, right? All of those capabilities, let's level up our sales org as an organization. Let's personalize all our outreach to every customer in our database. That's a good thing. That's a productivity inducing thing. There are real risks that come from that. Okay, so regulate the use of that kind of super capable model. Regulate, like ask for transparency there. Make some standards for security auditing, right? And the government has taken a leadership here. There's standardized risk assessment tools that are on the Canadian government's website. Are they perfect? No, but we're still figuring this stuff out. But it's the right signal saying, hey, here's how we're identifying where risks appear. Investment in cybersecurity is super important there. Asking for transparency from large organizations in how they use it, creating audit systems, right, which show, hey, what are the applications, and that gives this information gathering to policymakers for the future, all seem logical. You're not trusting a hyper-specific model to take over your sales org, right? You're gonna trust an OpenAI like O3, you're gonna trust an Anthropic's Claude and something like that because they're impressive, they're at the frontier, and as they keep pushing. But again, a hyper-specific model, some of the more use case specific AI applications that have been developed on these models don't have that scale of user impact. And so their governance should fall entirely under the spheres of what already exists for those tools, right? Like healthcare has comprehensive regulations. We know what harms we're trying to avoid in this sphere. It should fall under that. It shouldn't fall under a separate AI governance thing. And I know that Ada had this like conception of impact and harm, like harm was a big thing there, but it was just kind of vaguely defined. And the problems with harms are a lot of the commentary on how it was defining harms are like individual harms that are already understood under other spheres.
Right.
There are definitely unique AI specific harms, and those should be governed under AI regulation. But that's not the same as harm in the abstract.
Right.
And that doesn't mean we put everything under an umbrella of AI harm.
But I mean, we can put, actual sort of empirical facts behind that. And so one of the justifications for AIDA was, Amazon in the United States had a hiring algorithm where it disproportionately had a pilot hiring algorithm that was never actually released. They just used it internally, I might add, say that discriminated against, I think it was Black and Indigenous, particularly women, and basically said, oh, these people are less qualified. There's, bunk training data, bad training data, you could blame a million things. It never actually got used. And subsequent models much better, no evidence of discrimination. But so that was the justification. However, so Canada already has very explicit laws about discrimination in employment by race, by sexual identity, by gender, by creed, so what do we need AIDA for? If that's sort of the central driving core impetus and it's already covered under the Human Rights Act, if it's already covered in the Employment Act, what exactly are we worried about here? And the same thing goes for deepfakes. We have and revenge porn. We have a revenge porn act, and we have an elections act that political deepfakes to cover something Ryan mentioned earlier. We have an elections act that could cover that as well. And so, is it more work? Yes. The legislators will have to go in piece by piece and say, here's this act and here's where it's applicable. But on the other hand, it means you don't get random people that are caught up in nothing. And so this case that I like to point out for AIDA is, we were going to regulate high impact systems, and the way they defined it was very broad. It was anything that changes how consumers are prioritized. And so let's say I'm a cell phone repair shop. I'm a mom and pop cell phone. Me and my wife own a cell phone repair shop, and with our 12-year-old running around in the back helping repair, right? So we decide we're going to use AI to help prioritize customers based on our inventory. All of a sudden, now we are high risk, we are high impact. Now we have to play by the regulators' rules, and now we have to probably spend about $500,000 per year on regulatory coherence and regulatory compliance. Does that sound like a good value proposition to you? Does that sound like it's justified with the amount of risk that a cell phone repair shop might have in terms of prioritizing customers coming in to repair their iPhones?
Yeah, no, great points. You've highlighted some of these deficiencies that were no doubt part of the reason why they have at least signaled a pause on the future of ADA. And to the complexity point, Lawrence, there's always the omnibus bill where you change a number of things at once. But yeah, I mean, it's a very good point that AI has countless applications. And when we're talking about harms, they're really concrete and specific and occur in other domains. And that's where you should focus. And for the things that are unique to AI, that's what can be covered under future legislation that may come at some point. Before we go to audience questions, which we'll do in just a minute or so, one question for you about productivity, because Ryan, that came up in your paper and yours to a certain extent as well, Lawrence. The jury's kind of out in general. I know we can't generalize too much because there's so many different applications of AI, but in terms of how productivity enhancing it can be, and obviously there are some concerns in some domains. Being applied, and they've just it's just led to big layoffs, right? And I want to get your sense of do we know how AI can be, whether it can be applied and have widespread productivity gains, or is that something we're a little less certain on? How do you kind of understand these productivity questions in connection to AI's adoption?
Well, I think
Look, it's all sort of. Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say that I don't think the jury's out on the productivity benefits at all. I think it's extremely clear that it is a productivity booster. Does that mean everyone's used it correctly? No. Right? When we look at the analyses of AI's productivity in the software engineering space, it has definitely increased output. It's definitely increased, the speed at which code is published. The amount of work a junior developer can do, all of that kind of stuff. Like almost every paper on coding assistants has shown impact. Does that mean every company has used them properly? No. And part of it is cultural change. Part of it's the process changes that we've already discussed. But part of it is also understanding what your organization's objectives are. And so when you said layoffs versus productivity gains, in software, a lot of the initial estimates were, well, maybe you'll need fewer software engineers because they're working so much faster. I believe the consensus now is that that's not true, because we had a giant backlog of demand for software that we just didn't have enough people or enough time or enough resources to care about. But now that we're working more productively in that space, the demand for software increases. More can be done there. And so demand for software engineer increases, the demand for code that's written increases. There are tons of industries with those kinds of dynamics where there is a significant amount of demand that would only be unlocked if things were faster and cheaper. Is every industry like that? No. So there are some industries where productivity gains actually means reduced headcount, because it is just deliver the service as we currently have. Nobody wants more of that thing.
Right.
This creates a lot of reworking of our economic organization, but we've already been going through this process. The internet did the same thing, and more work is moved towards digital knowledge work against more traditional, analog labor applications. So it's just an extension of what's been happening for decades. Is it faster? Is it more powerful? Yes. But just as with the digital economy transformation, there are laggards who didn't use it well. There are middle-sized adopters who used it just to do the bare minimum and kind of cut their headcounts. And then we have an entire crop of radically transformative companies like Amazon and Google that employ thousands of people and that have completely remade our economy. And so that continuum applies the same to AI.
Great. Lawrence, any comments on this question?
No, I mean, I think we should jump to audience questions.
Sure.
I think Ryan's pretty much covered what I want to say.
You should have went first on that one anyway. So this one's for you then first, Lawrence. We've talked a lot about the EU and US, but this person asks, what about China, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia? I note that there's been some concern about Saudi Arabia being invited to the UN AI summit coming up. What do you have to say about their approaches to AI and how it connects to Canada's?
So I don't know a lot about Saudi Arabia's regulatory approach. I know that their sort of overall approach has been build, baby, build, which I think is sort of hitting the right notes. Whether or not they can continue to sort of throw money and lead, that remains to be seen, as we've seen with DeepSeek, to lead into sort of the next part of your question. But they have a lot of capital, and certainly right now it's a very capital hungry industry for now, barring changes to the frontier models and how they function. I think China presents a very different approach to it, and the government, their central government, has spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of energy and effort literally energy, propping up these companies that do this research. And then you get sort of upstarts like DeepSeek that come out of nowhere and is, not to oversimplify it, but for people not familiar, DeepSeek was basically a bunch of people that didn't work in AI decide to get together on like a Saturday afternoon over beers to build an AI model, and they made one by Monday that was basically the equivalent of many of the global leading models. And so it shows that there's more to be had here than simply throwing money at things. And that's why you may have seen news that it made everyone quite nervous, because it was not, AI engineers spending billions of dollars doing research and tearing their hairs out. It was like a couple of guys sitting around a computer being like, what if we did this? Oh, this sounds fun. And they built an AI model. And so it shows that there's alternate approaches. And I think the Chinese model has been very focused on open source. And to go back to this discussion that we've had on open source versus proprietary, and I think some of that is motivated by geopolitical strategizing and positioning. And how does China make itself invaluable to the global South coalition that they've been trying to build up? And you see them trying to export their AI models across Southeast Asia, across Africa, across South America. And open source is basically sort of a marketing vector in which they can use to say, here's how we're differentiated from those American guys.
Ryan, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree most of there as well, right? And when we look at China, one thing to comment about the post DeepSeek moment, so it did show, right, that creativity is still super valuable in this field and not just high amounts of money. Obviously, the actual story is a little bit more complex, right? They
It's
probably
exaggerated
did
for
have
effect.
they probably did have access to more things, but in general, it's not OpenAI level of things, right? It's not unbelievable amount of money and capital, but still a decent amount. But they were scrappy and innovative. The thing that happens afterwards, though, is that the second they became strategically important, right? We've seen China impose a restriction on the travel of DeepSeek researchers. There's a lot more CCP involvement now and their future guided research. And the models that they've released since R1 have not had the same moment that their major model earlier this year has had. So there is something about the governance mechanics of China where it's like, okay, their environment enables a lot of innovation, but does it enable them to keep that sustained momentum? I believe in many ways, right, when we're talking about the political risks of AI, a centralized government such as the Chinese Communist Party is far more afraid of those political risks than an American leader would be or a Canadian leader would be. And so that's why you have these investments, you have these new models crop up, but there's just as much anxiety about the use there as there is here. And that means that we shouldn't just kind of enter this frame where it's like, if we're not going to do what the Chinese are, it's like, well, they have the same anxieties, if not greater, because the freedom and the capabilities that these models provide the average person are a much more long-term threat to their society than to ours.
Right.
And if you think our bureaucracy kills things,
they're much more powerful, indeed. Okay, some questions about safeguards and risks here. How do we protect against algorithmic harm? So we have a question here about disinformation and misinformation. I guess I would add as well the addictiveness. There's a lot of research that goes into product design in the tech space in general, really aimed at fostering kind of being psychologically manipulative, trying to kind of foster addiction and constant attention in the attention economy. How do you think you approach these sort of issues? Is it just build baby build and this kind of libertarian mindset, or do we need some alternative approach? I think it's fair to say that regardless, like the society is very split on this, right? There's certain mindset that favors one approach and another that is much more concerned. So maybe there's an approach that balances.
there's plenty of approaches. I mean, I don't think anyone thinks that the current approach of sort of letting deepfakes do whatever they want is sustainable. But whether that means government has to come down heavy-handed with a anti-deepfake act is sort of one extreme, and on the other extreme you have let's not do anything. And somewhere closer to the not do anything sort of camp is there's asking companies and having a standard in which companies label things. And so that might be one sort of very simple, anything created with any kind of deepfake software will be labeled, this is a deepfake, do not believe this if it's trying to tell you something wrong. Are there ways to game that? Of course. And so there you can imagine sort of a spectrum of options, and I think at the very extreme end would be doing legislation banning deepfakes, or creating some kind of mega fine for companies responsible. And anytime you do that, there's always sort of these costs, and there's always these who falls into what category issues in games. And so there's always trade-offs, but I don't think that it's sustainable necessarily. And I think, whereas on the other hand, with addictive app design, that's something that's happening already, like AI or not. And so is AI the issue, or is it accelerating an existing issue? And is it a level of harm that we want to regulate? Is it a level of harm that we want to kind of societally say, let's vote with our wallets and let's not buy loot boxes in video games, and let's not get commodified on social media? And so that's sort of a societal question that can be resolved with government action, and I can certainly see a use case for that in extreme scenarios. But is it something where government has to be an early mover to crack down? I would say even the EU hasn't done that, and they're perhaps the most regulation heavy jurisdiction. I mean, they have to a certain extent, but not on the AI front.
Yeah, just some quick comments on this. One is that this is one of the areas where actually proprietary is preferable to open source, because when we look at the large companies, they put in many more safeguards around malicious use than the open source players, because their open source incentive is to let everyone build. So when it comes to things like deepfakes or image generation or whatnot, you're not able to create revenge porn off a Google model, right? But the thing that's just shared on GitHub for anyone to take access to probably does allow that. And so if we want to create a society where, there's the right incentives, even the market incentives Lawrence was talking about, there is something about having these under the umbrella of corporations that face those kinds of audits and restrictions and that accountability, rather than just developers going wild, allows us to create that. But one other kind of point on this is, like, you're talking about the synergies here. People often say OpenAI is the most innovative AI company in the world. In reality, it's TikTok. TikTok is the frontier AI company, right? And they have models that understand you and what you want to see better than anyone else. And in China, the use of TikTok is heavily regulated because they understand that there. And so there are some models places going where it's like, who is allowed to use these things? At what level do we expect someone to be mature enough to use it well? Can we put in artificially things like time restrictions? And, the phones have these default things saying, like, the app shuts down after X amount of minutes. But those are not AI regulations. Those are consumer protection regulations. And so that's the area that they should be thought of under.
Yeah, that reinforces some points previously made by both of you throughout the conversation. So before we conclude, I'd just like to turn it back over to you both for final remarks. What would you say? Where does Canada need to go from here?
Look, success to me means we have AI deployed broadly across the economy. We retain and build out our research, and we have niche strategic sectors that Canada is not only a player in, but dominates in globally from an export perspective. So how do we get there? That's up to policy design and program design. Failure would mean, we're compliant, but irrelevant. We're dependent on foreign platforms and rules, and we kind of we talk about AI and we continue to pontificate and give speeches at G7 and G20 about AI is important, but at the same time, we don't really want to use AI. And so how do we prevent ourselves from getting to that failure perspective, and how do we get to the success perspective? I think bears a lot of thinking and hasn't necessarily been thought of comprehensively yet.
Yeah, just to add on slightly, the entire history of the current wave of the AI revolution is tied to Canada and Canadian research institutions, dating back to the 40s. The entire idea of neural networks comes from a researcher at McGill, Donald Hebb, in the 1940s. And we were the only country to invest in this in the 70s and 80s when no one else thought they were useful anywhere else in the world. And we've continued to invest in that research to this day. Failure is Canada not capitalizing on its own history here and nobody remembering or acknowledging it. One of the saddest things to me is the fact that when we discuss AI in the public context in Canada, we don't know our own importance here. We don't know our own research history. And that makes it so much harder to motivate a next generation of people to build world leading companies here if they don't appreciate and respect Canada's role in shaping this.
Mm. Well, very good. It seems like there is a lot of low-hanging fruit and tremendous opportunity for us here to take, if only we have the courage and wherewithal to seize it. So I want to thank you both for being here, for your great insights, and to everyone listening. Please, a reminder to like and subscribe. That is very important for us to get these ideas out to as many people as possible. I'm Peter Copeland for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thanks for being with us.